Hi there. We all have to have some rules in life, and one of the rules I have is if you see Hiroyuki Kusuda's wines in a wine shop, think seriously about buying them. When you see them on sale, as I found this one, buy them. So today I thought I'd try Hiroyuki Kusuda's Martinborough Syrah. This is the 2019 vintage of this. Fortunate to come across it. Hiroyuki, to give him his full name, is a fascinating character. Born in Tokyo, he qualified as a lawyer at one of Tokyo's top colleges. Decided not to practice as a lawyer. He worked for Fujitsu at one stage. He was also Japan's consul general in Sydney for a couple of years. But all this time he harboured a deep love for wine. Evidently at one stage he had translated a lot of Robert Parker's Wine Advocate into Japanese. And that had really built an interest in wine for him that he'd resisted for a while. But then in the late 90s he finally gave in and headed to Germany, to Geisenheim, to study winemaking. While he was there, he was sent to New Zealand as part of one of the projects he had to complete, was to work for Kai Schubert in Martinborough. And obviously he loved it there because in 2001 he returned to Martinborough with the aim of making wine there and made his first vintage in 2002. Martinborough, obviously an area better known for its Pinot Noirs and its Chardonnays, but can produce some lovely Syrahs. One of the things I think about Hiro that is impressive is that he so clearly, you can see in him what his wines turn out to be. He's a man with real sort of calm, serenity, confidence, a very humble man, but also somebody who I think you see all this projected onto his wines. There's a purity, a self-assurance in the style of the wine. They're wines made for aging. They're wines with great balance. And yes, to my mind, this is the person projecting themselves onto the wine that they make. I find it fascinating. So this particular wine, the production was tiny. There were 2,929 bottles made, and that's a normal level of production for these wines. The Syrah was handpicked and mostly destemmed. I think about 5% of it stayed as whole bunches, but the fruit was crushed and allowed to have a cold soak for a week. And what a cold soak does is it takes colour and it takes aroma from the fruit without the presence of alcohol, which later in fermentation will be there. And so you can produce some beautifully aromatic wines as a result of this. The wine then goes into fermenting vessels, open stainless steel fermenters, where there are pump overs, and for a period of about 4 weeks, relatively long maceration, pump overs, push downs, and then that's run off into French oak, but only a small proportion of that, about 20% was new, and aging quite extended, actually 20 months, which is quite a long time for this sort of style of wine. And then bottled with just a sort of a very coarse filtration and no fining. So trying to keep the purity of the wine to the fore there, trying to emphasise the purity of the fruit through the cold soak and then keep it into the bottle there. So let's have a look at the wine, shall we? First thing to say is there's a beautiful purple robe to this. It's quite a sort of a dark ruby colour, but a purple rim. Not a blue purple, but a red purple. And there's a reasonable depth of colour there. It's dark, it's reasonably deep. There's not a huge pour in here, but I can only just see the stem of the glass as I look down through it. There are actually a reasonable amount of tears flowing down the glass, which, considering the wine is only 12.5% alcohol according to the label, would suggest that there's a fair tannic content to that. So let's smell the wine. And that really is quite impressive. You've got a lovely intensity of ripe, juicy, dark fruit. There's black cherries, there's dark plums, there's a sort of a velvety dark plum note. There are notes of chocolate, coffee, and with all this ripeness there's also a sort of a savoury note as well. There are perhaps notes of spice, little cedar, but all beautifully harmoniously combined with the fruit there, and with lovely intensity as well. So let's try it. Tasting that, it's dry and it's mid-weight, and the tannins are drying, but they manage to be drying without being astringent, which is an interesting balancing act, because the tannins are very, very fine, and there's a sort of a cedary quality to them, but as they reach a stage where they're about to become drying and astringent, the juicy fruit cuts back in, and there's this lovely black cherry, dark fruit to black plum note. But often when you get black plum flavours, they're sort of heading over into more sort of developed prune notes. That's not the case with this. The freshness, there's a lovely combination of fresh acidity. It's not tart, it's not particular, but there's it's making my mouth water slightly. But in combination with the lovely fine tannins and the bitterness that that's providing, there's a beautiful balance between those. The alcohol at just 12.5% is not interfering with the flavours at all. It's completely overlaid by the flavours. It does mean that the wine isn't huge, so the alcohol's not adding enormous body to it. This is at best medium bodied, but there's a wonderful concentration. There's a sort of a licoricey quality. There's a sort of slightly velvety texture. There's also a chocolatey smoothness and the drying cedar, so there's plenty going on in here. And the flavours are lasting. There's a lovely, long, savoury note in my mouth. I mentioned spiciness in terms of the nose. There is some of a chemical called rotenone here, which normally will produce the sort of black pepper notes for Syrah or Shiraz. But here it's almost becoming more of a sort of a bitter licorice. It's not particularly being spicy, but again, it's perfectly poised, and there's just the freshness of the acidity is just keeping the finish lively. There's an intensity to the fruit, there's a precision to the acidity and a length of flavour that makes me think that this wine would very happily last for 10, 15, 20 years probably. But there's no need to keep it for that, because it's actually, it's approachable now. I think keeping it for 5 or 6 years will allow that fruit to open up, and you'll see a lot more of the wonderful character that you get on the nose showing through on the palate. But it is fascinating. I mean, this has been in my mouth for a couple of minutes now, and I can still taste the wine. I don't have to keep going back and tasting it. It's got a beautiful persistence. So yes, Hiroyuki Kusuda's 2019 Syrah from Martinborough. My advice would be, if you see it on a shelf, well worth considering picking it up. Thank you very much for joining us. I hope you'll consider following us or liking and sharing these videos, and I do hope you'll join us again. Bye now.